Stuart is highly regarded as one of the world's leading advocates for contemporary forms of Anabaptism. Stuart is a scholar, a trainer, a mentor, a writer, strategist, and a consultant with particular interest in urban mission, church planning, and emerging forms of church. Stuart is one of the founders of Urban Expression, a pioneering church planning agency with teams in the United Kingdom, Netherlands, and the United States. He has served as Director of Church Planning and Evangelism at Spurgeon's College in London, and he still finds time and energy with his other activities to serve as Associate Lecturer at the Baptist College in Bristol, where he lives. Stuart has a PhD in Anabaptist hermeneutics. Stuart's also written several books on church planning, urban mission, and the contribution of the Anabaptist tradition to contemporary missiology. His two most recent books, which you may have heard of, are titled The Power of All and The Naked Anabaptist. Stuart is married to Sean, has 2 grown sons and 2 grandchildren, and Stuart and Sean, as I noted, reside in Bristol, England, from where Stuart is joining us today. So, Stuart, I'm glad to have you here. Take us away.
Well, good afternoon or good evening. Bristol at the moment is wet and windy, but the snow that we had during the webinar that some of you participated in last week has all gone. So it's feeling quite a bit warmer today. I gather that some of you, but not all of you, were involved in the webinar a week ago when we looked in particular at monologue sermons and alternatives, a multi-voiced approach to learning. I will refer back once or twice to things that I said then, but I'm not going to assume that everybody was involved in that. What we are looking at this evening is a little bit more generic than that. That was a particular example of what a multi-voiced church might look like and how it might operate. What we're looking at this evening is something of a vision for a multi-voiced church, and want to look at some of the ways in which multi-voice practices can affect different aspects of church life. My contention is that multi-voice churches are at least 3 things. First of all, more consistent with the biblical ecclesiology. Secondly, more likely to produce mature disciples. And thirdly, more missionally potent. And I want, in the course of the next 40 minutes, to say a bit about each of those. The conviction that we start with is that in the New Testament, what we know about church life indicates that multi-voiced rather than mono-voiced was the norm. We don't have a huge amount of information about how the early churches operated, but what we do have certainly suggests that multi-voiced is a reasonable description of how they operated. One of the key passages, which we will encounter several times this evening, is 1 Corinthians 14. The most extensive description of local church life and practice in the New Testament. And this has been a favourite passage of movements throughout the history of the church that have rediscovered and reintroduced multi-voice practices. Secondly, my argument is that multi-voice church, as distinct from mono-voice church, is much more likely to produce mature disciples. Multi-voice church does not produce passive consumers who may be well instructed but struggle to know how to apply what they're learning. Multi-voice church requires participation, it requires application, and in my view it's much more likely to produce the kind of active discipleship that is crucial for our future. And thirdly, and I want to say more about this towards the end of this presentation, I believe that this is significant for mission. This is not just some kind of internal issue to do with smartening up church life, but it's something which is hugely significant for the way in which we engage in mission. I'll say more about that as we go on. So my thesis today is that multi-voiced church is consistent with the way in which the early churches operated, both in the New Testament and in the early years of the Christian movement after that, and that despite the dominance of the mono-voiced tradition, again and again through the history of the church, as renewal movements returned to the New Testament, as renewal movements rediscovered the Jesus of the Gospels, again and again multi-voice church made a reappearance. First generation renewal movements, not always but very, very often, exhibit traits of multi-voice church, that act as a provocation and as a renewal to the wider church. Multi-voice church, for those who discover it for the first time, for those who have only experienced mono-voice church, is a bit like a soloist being engulfed by an orchestra. It's exciting, it's liberating, it's transformative. It can also be a bit scary. If you've been used to a form of church life which is highly controlled, dependent on one voice or a few voices, suddenly to be in a situation where many voices are being liberated, where it's open for all to participate, that can be both exciting and quite scary at the same time. And one of the struggles that those movements that have experimented with or recovered multi-voiced church practices have had to grapple with is, how do you channel the energies that are released? How do you channel the excitement, the enthusiasm, the sheer sense of freedom that young multi-voice churches experience? How do you ensure that the different contributions that are made are really for the building up of the Christian community? How do you ensure that the orchestra is playing a recognizable tune rather than just a cacophony? How does multi-voice church work in practice? And one of the things that is evident, I think, from the history of multi-voice church is that good habits and good practices need to be developed if multi-voice church is to be truly healthy. And that, of course, is something which is as old as the New Testament. That passage that I referred to a few moments ago in 1 Corinthians 14 describes the church in Corinth, which was very clearly multi-voiced, but which was also suffering from severe problems. It was a church where there was great freedom. It was a church where there was an expectancy that the Spirit of God would speak through many different people. It was a church where all kinds of things were happening, and there was a great deal of enthusiasm. But as Paul writes to them, he is concerned that there's a lack of clarity, there's a lack of accountability. The various contributions are not really all building up the church. And the phrase that comes again and again in that chapter is about the building up or the edification of the community. What Paul doesn't do is say to this young church, you're making a mistake and you really shouldn't be multi-voiced. Why not just authorize one or two people who have gifts and abilities to lead your worship and to do your teaching? He doesn't do that at all. He encourages them to continue with their multi-voice practice. He says to them that he wants them all to prophesy, he wants them all to speak in tongues, he wants them all to exercise the various gifts of the Spirit, but he wants them to do it in a way that builds up the body. And so this chapter is corrective. It is not a chapter that is discouraging multi-voice church. And that remains a challenge for multi-voice churches through the centuries. How do you liberate people? How do you empower people without causing chaos and confusion? And sadly, the experience of some churches and some movements that have been multi-voiced has been that they haven't quite been able to work that out. And that has caused significant amounts of pain. But it is this chapter 1 Corinthians 14 that has been both the inspiration and at times the corrective influence on these movements. It's a chapter that you find again and again through the history of the church, not so much in the mainstream church, where it seems pretty clear that the theologians and interpreters weren't quite sure what to make of it, but in the renewal movements, in the marginal communities, in those who were convinced that the New Testament offered a pattern for Christian discipleship, for Christian worship, for Christian community. Again and again, this passage re-emerges. So, what is multi-voice church? How does it operate? My very simple definition is a multi-voice church is a move away from the kind of Christian community where one voice, or a relatively small number of voices, say everything and do everything. The mono-voice tradition has been very strong in all the major branches of the Christian church, and has meant that various individuals, known as priests or pastors or ministers or apostles or whatever other name you want to choose, have so often been dominant. Or if not a single voice, then a small group of elders or deacons, a ministry team, again a range of different words and descriptions. But the majority of the community in the mono-voice tradition has been passive, has been recipient rather than participant. The mono-voice church has been dominant for so long that in so many places it is simply assumed to be normal. Multi-voice church is a significant challenge to that. Multi-voice church suggests that this is not normal, this is not adequate, this is not healthy. But instead, church life needs to be a community of participation. It needs to involve many, many different people. Not just vocally, although multi-voiced certainly points in that direction, but using the range of gifts that God has given to his people. In the book that Anton referred to in his introduction, The Power of All, my wife and I, who have written this book together, explore 4 main dimensions of multi-voice church. What does it mean for a church to be multi-voiced in its worship, in its learning, in its discernment and decision-making, and in the way it exercises pastoral care? So let me say just a little bit about each of those, just to give you a glimpse of what I mean by multi-voice church in these areas. What does multi-voiced worship look like? Well, it means a move away from front-led worship, where everything is dictated by those who have responsibility to lead from the front. It means an empowering of the whole congregation, the whole community, to participate in worship together. It means an invitation to all members of the community to offer praise and worship to God in a whole variety of ways. Multi-voice churches have available to them a whole raft of different possibilities in terms of how they express praise and worship. In multi-voice worship, participants have an opportunity to retell the great story of God and also to connect their own stories with that great story. One of the very significant aspects of multi-voice worship, I believe, is testimony. The testimony is the story of the people of God joined to the big story of God. And by testimony, I don't mean rather hackneyed stories of experiences with Christ maybe 15, 20 or 40 years ago. I mean effectively reports from the front. Stories of what God has been doing this week. Stories of where people have seen God at work and how that connects with the great story of God that the church tells through the centuries. Multi-voice worship enables a community to sound different tones in worship. One of the problems in many churches that I visit is what I would refer to as the tyranny of joyfulness. The mood is unremittingly upbeat. All the songs are upbeat. All the moods are upbeat. Whereas the reality is that in all communities there will be a range of emotions and a range of feelings if we allow them to be expressed. Multi-voice worship gives us an opportunity to worship in the way that the Psalms, the great worship book of the Bible, does, drawing on the full range of human emotions. It's very difficult for mono-voice church to approximate to that. Multi-voice worship doesn't abolish the role of worship leaders. It doesn't mean that those who are particularly gifted musically or in other forms of worship are unable to flourish, but it does dramatically reduce our dependence on these gifted people. I won't say a great deal about multi-voice learning because we spent a whole presentation on that a week ago for those of you who were there, but multi-voice learning puts the emphasis less on presentation, on preaching, on teaching, on communication, and much more on the learning. The question is not how good the preacher was, but how much are we learning as a community? And what forms of instruction might be helpful, enabling us to become a learning community? Is the monologue sermon the only way of communicating? Is the dominance of that form of communication justified? Or do we need a much richer diet, a much broader range of ways of communicating? Given that different people learn in different ways, have different learning preferences, wouldn't it be helpful to have a much wider range of learning styles available in the church? Perhaps there are many more people who could participate in the learning process than simply relying on those who are gifted preachers. Now again, I'm not suggesting that we never have sermons. I'm not wanting to disempower or disenfranchise those who are gifted as preachers and teachers. I simply want to suggest that that is only part of the picture, and that a multi-voiced community will learn how to make good use of sermons as part of a more varied diet. Thirdly, in relation to discernment and decision-making, how does a multi-voice community move forward towards the purposes of God? Yes, there's certainly room for leadership. Yes, there's room for vision casting, for decisiveness, but there is also an expectation that the place in which the mind of Christ is discovered is when the community meets together and, under the guidance of the Spirit and carefully led, is able to draw on the wisdom and the insights of all. Now that's quite a demanding process. In many ways, monovoice leadership, monovoice decision-making is much simpler, more straightforward. But multi-voiced discernment gives us an opportunity to draw on the riches of the community. It does mean developing processes that will enable the reticent to speak, that will make sure that those who are less reticent don't speak too much. It will enable the marginalized to be drawn in and to make their contribution. It is a skill, it's an art. It will require a community to learn how to listen well to one another, how to make decisions that are based on discernment as the whole community meets together. It means being open not only to the will of the majority, but to the prophetic insight of the minority, and the courageous willingness from time to time to follow the voice of the minority rather than the majority. This kind of spiritual discernment is not the same as democracy. As with all aspects of multi-voice church, this is an art to be learned, and there are processes that are needed. Again, this does not abolish the role of leadership. It doesn't mean that there is no casting of vision. It doesn't mean that leaders are disempowered. But it does change their role somewhat, and it does involve the whole community in a process which leads to far greater ownership than simply passively receiving a vision that's been shared from one or just a few voices. And fourthly, the area of pastoral care. I don't know whether in your churches you have the same comment sometimes that I've heard in a number of churches in the UK. I was sick and nobody visited me. What that has sometimes meant is actually I was sick and 3 or 4 members of the congregation came to see me, but the pastor didn't come to see me. Nobody from the pastoral team visited me, and therefore I haven't been visited. Many years ago, when I was a church leader in East London, in a relatively young church, I encountered exactly that situation. A member of our community was unwell and in hospital, and I had ensured that at least half a dozen members of the congregation had been in to see her. I was intending to go in myself at some point, but it was an extremely busy period, and it seemed better to ensure that several people went to see her rather than waiting a few days for me. When she emerged out of hospital, her complaint was that she hadn't been visited, even though at least half a dozen had been to see her. And I realized then the power of the mono-voiced approach to pastoral care. Not that it was something we encouraged in the church, but somehow the tradition was so strong that this lady was convinced that she really hadn't been pastored properly. Multi-voice pastoral care means that we take responsibility for each other as a community. One of the things that we work with in the book that we've written is the range of one another verses in the New Testament. That phrase one another comes over and over and over again, and it gives an indication of the different responsibilities that we have to and for each other. Now again, this doesn't do away with pastors, it doesn't do away with pastoral teams and pastoral systems, but it does mean we are less reliant on them. It does mean that we are more willing to take responsibility for and to one another. It brings up the issue of accountability, which we'll look at a bit later. One of the aspects of pastoral care that is unpopular in our culture, but is crucial according to the New Testament, is a responsibility to walk with each other and watch over one another in love. That if we wander off the path, if we find ourselves behaving in ways that are less than Christian, we need our brothers and sisters to help us to get back on track again. So those are the kinds of things that I mean by multi-voice church. There are, of course, other areas of church life as well, but those are 4 key areas where I think the difference between mono-voiced and multi-voiced approaches to church are very obvious. A week ago in the webinar presentation, as I looked through the chat box afterwards, I'm sorry that I can't both present and handle my PowerPoints and look at the chat box at the same time, but as I looked through the chat box afterwards, one of the questions that I was asked and didn't have an opportunity to respond to was what my own local church is like and to what extent it is multi-voiced. So I thought I would just say a little bit about that this evening, even if the person who asked that question isn't a participant in this webinar. My wife and I are members of a Baptist church here in Bristol. It's in the multicultural inner city part of Bristol, and so is a delightfully mixed community. Roughly half of the community would be from Jamaica, although many were born in this country and so are second or third generation immigrants. The remainder of the community is a mixture of Anglo-Saxon and a range of other nationalities, including Latin American and Indian. So it's a diverse community. Community of about 80 adults and maybe 15 to 20 children. So a relatively small community where most people know each other, at least by name, and often have long-standing relationships with each other. To what extent is it multi-voiced? Well, we are not in leadership. We're not responsible for the direction in which the community is moving, but we do have opportunities to have some influence. And we have been delighted to see the way in which the community seems naturally to be multi-voiced and very open to moving further in that direction. So 9 days ago, on Sunday morning, a weekend when we were actually away from the church, we discovered that the person leading had determined that the church was to worship in a much more multi-voice way than usual. He had not prepared a set order of service, but he had warned the congregation the week before that it was going to be a meeting patterned very much on 1 Corinthians 14, where there was an expectation that everybody would bring a contribution. As I say, we weren't there, but the reports that we heard on Sunday were that it had been an excellent service. This past Sunday, my wife and I were responsible for the teaching in the church, and we were presenting the second of two presentations spread across a fortnight. And we taught together so that there were two voices rather than one in the teaching session, and after about 20 minutes of teaching, we then divided the community into small discussion groups where they were able to work together on applying some of the teaching that we'd given. So the church community that we're part of is certainly exhibiting some aspects of multi-voiced church life, and we hope that it will continue to move in that direction. Let me move on a bit to talk a bit about the role of multi-voiced church life in the Anabaptist tradition that is very much part of the heritage of the community that many of you are part of. I want to suggest that Anabaptism was a decisively multi-voiced movement, that from its very beginnings, for at least the first 2 or 3 generations, there were all kinds of aspects of the Anabaptist tradition that were multi-voiced. If you go back to some of the very earliest communities in the 16th century in Switzerland, you find communities that revelled in the freedom that 1 Corinthians 14 had given to them, and were very concerned that the state churches with which they were familiar were nothing like as multi-voiced as the New Testament seemed to indicate they should be. 1527, one of the earliest documents of the Swiss Anabaptist movement, a document called the Swiss Order, which was an attempt to spell out for these emerging Anabaptist communities what should happen when they met together. And in the midst of this, we find this statement: when brothers and sisters are together, they shall take up something to read together. The one to whom God has given the best understanding should explain it, the other should be still and listen. So the reliance is not upon some authorized interpreter. There's no assumption that the same person will teach every week. There is an expectation that all members of the community should be open to the prompting of the Spirit, open to God giving a good understanding. There is also some discipline involved. It's not a free-for-all. As one speaks, the others should be still and listen. Another very early document is a tract from, I think, the same year, 1527, maybe 1528, which has a rather cumbersome title. It's something like An Answer to Those Who Inquire of Us Why We Will Not Attend the State Churches. It's a tract that explains to those who are questioning them why the early Anabaptists would not attend the state churches. And the whole of the tract is a kind of manifesto, really, for multi-voice church. Here's just one little extract from it. They complain about the state churches. When someone comes to church and constantly hears only one person speaking, and all the listeners are silent, neither speaking nor prophesying, who can or will regard or confess the same to be a spiritual congregation? or confess, according to 1 Corinthians 14, yep, that's that passage again, that God is dwelling and operating in them through his Holy Spirit with his gifts, impelling them one after the other in the above-mentioned order of speaking and prophesying. Why wouldn't they go to the state churches? Well, actually, there were a number of reasons, but in this particular tract, this is what they said. This is not a spiritual congregation. This is not what church is meant to be. Church is not a place where you just hear one voice, one authoritative voice. But church is a place where God speaks through all kinds of people. That's what a church is, according to these early Anabaptists. That's the Swiss experience. What about elsewhere? Well, Ambrosius Spittelmeyer from Nickelsburg had a very similar view. Writing about the experience of his communities, he said this: when they come together, they teach each other the divine word, and one asks the others, how do you understand this saying? When they come together, they teach each other the divine word. There's an expectation that they will be a learning community, an interpretive community, a hermeneutic community, where they will ask questions, they will listen to each other, they will share their insights, and together they will work on the understanding of a biblical passage. Please excuse my cough. I had that last week and it hasn't gone away yet. The rule of Christ. Another aspect of Anabaptist understandings of church was that the community was a place of accountable discipleship. What is sometimes referred to as church discipline, or as the ban, is often known by Anabaptists as the rule of Christ. And the passage on which they reflected deeply was a very short passage in Matthew 18, a passage where Jesus says, if your brother or sister sins against you, this is how you respond. It's a very short passage that sets out 4 steps of confrontation, of accountability, of fellowship. Interactive pastoral care might be a rather cozier way of describing it than the ban. What Jesus is setting out, according to Matthew, in this passage, is a way in which a community of recovering sinners, the church, can ensure that the community is not unduly damaged by things that go wrong. That when relationships are broken, when people are hurt, there is a way of responding, there is a way of engaging with it, which doesn't destroy the community. I find it a very significant passage. It's a passage that is, again, rediscovered by many renewal movements through the history of the church, the Anabaptists certainly, but many others as well. But it's a passage that is very uncongenial, very uncongenial in contemporary culture, where individualism is rampant and the idea of being accountable to one another and responsible for each other is difficult. But it's something which the Anabaptists were convinced about, and it's something which is essential for healthy multi-voice communities. The rule of Christ means that we take responsibility for one another. For the Anabaptists, their baptism was an invitation to participate in this kind of community. As they were baptized, they said to their brothers and sisters, please will you watch over me? Please will you help me to be a follower of Jesus? And I believe that is something which is countercultural today, but essential for healthy communities and for mature discipleship. One thing I find very significant about this passage in Matthew 18 is that leaders are not mentioned. This is not some process which leaders apply to the community. It's often been interpreted that way. In fact, in the mainstream churches through the centuries, the practice of church discipline has often been oppressive, indeed sometimes even lethal. But that's not the essence of the passage. This is a one another passage. This is a call to the community to exercise this kind of pastoral care for each other. So much for the history. What about today? Why does multi-voice church matter? Is it significant? There are so many challenges facing us in today's culture. How important is multi-voice church? Does it really matter that much? Let me suggest a number of reasons why I believe it does. And then as we come towards the end of the presentation, I look forward to engaging with some of the questions that you may have. First of all, let's think a bit about our changing culture. What kind of church life is appropriate for the kind of culture into which we're moving? A a wider culture that is often described using the term postmodern. Postmodern means a whole range of things, but certainly it challenges some of the expectations and assumptions of the past in terms of authority structures, in terms of community processes. In a changing culture, what kind of church is going to be good news? Now, I'm not suggesting that we are simply co-opted by our culture. I'm not suggesting that every change in our culture should produce a change in the church. But I do believe that at a time of culture shift, which we're currently experiencing in Western societies, we have a tremendous opportunity to use the changes in our culture as a stimulus to re-examine the biblical evidence, to re-examine the historic practices of the church, and to ask what is truly biblical, what is truly healthy. Are some of the practices that we're familiar with in our churches not as much biblical as simply the result of being co-opted by a previous culture? An example for me of that is the dominance of the monologue sermon. Why am I concerned that we develop alternatives to the monologue? Well, partly because our culture does not respond well to unchallengeable monologues. This does not go down well in contemporary culture. We need to recognize that. But also because that changing culture prompts us to ask the question, well, where did monologue sermons come from? Why did they become so dominant? Is it something which is derived from Scripture? And actually, as we looked last week at the 4th and 5th century, when the church became part of empire, when these small domestic communities became massive cathedral congregations, monovoiced communication took over. And so a changing culture gives us an opportunity to re-examine our familiar practices and ask to what extent they are truly biblical and truly helpful. A second reason for looking very seriously at this issue is the reality that we're moving into a post-Christendom environment. Not just postmodern, but also post-Christendom. And in post-Christendom, the church will have fewer resources than we currently have. And we will simply not be able to sustain all the things that we currently do and are familiar with. Things may be somewhat different in Europe than in North America, but I suspect that we're moving in the same direction, albeit at different speeds. We are certainly in the UK moving towards a situation where relatively few local churches will have full-time paid staff, where there will be a much greater need for the congregation to take responsibility for a whole range of things that are currently delegated to paid staff. Multi-voice churches will thrive in that context. Mono-voice churches, I think, will find a tremendous struggle. Thirdly, I'm concerned about the level of dependency that I see in many churches. Multi-voice church is a way of reducing our dependency levels. It's a way also of preventing some of the somewhat toxic stress that I see among many church leaders. With fewer resources, they are finding the pressure growing and the expectations on them ever greater. Multi-voice church reduces some of our dependency on a few very tired people. Multi-voice church also addresses issues which I'm increasingly concerned about: biblical illiteracy and the inability to reflect theologically. Passive consumers of brilliant sermons are simply not being well equipped for those things. Fourthly, I want to go back to where I started. I believe that multi-voice church matters because it is the biblical pattern. That may be something we want to discuss, but I would suggest that both in the Old and the New Testament there is plenty of evidence that the expectation of God for his people is that they will be a participating community. For me, the clincher is the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit is poured out on all, and the expectation is that all will participate, young and old, men and women, everybody participating together in this new community of the kingdom. I also think it's tremendously important that we look at the missional dimension. I referred to that at the beginning, and I want to conclude with that. Why does multi-voice church matter for mission? Two reasons. First of all, I believe that participants in multi-voice churches are far more likely to be missionally effective than consumers, passive consumers in mono-voice churches. Those who have learned to talk about their faith within the Christian community are far more likely to be able to talk about their faith outside it. Those who have exercised effective pastoral care within the Christian community are far more likely to be good neighbours and to respond to pastoral opportunities beyond the church. Those who have learned to take part in a process of discernment and decision-making, who have learned how to listen well and how to contribute constructively to discussions, are far more likely to be able to engage missionally in those sorts of conversations with people of other faiths or of no faith. What I'm suggesting is that multi-voice churches equip people for mission, that consumers in passive mono-voiced communities are not well equipped for mission, no matter how many training courses they've been on, no matter how many books on evangelism or social action they've read, that they are simply not being equipped. They are simply not learning the basic practices that equip people for mission. And secondly, I believe that multi-voice churches in contemporary culture are far more likely to be attractive to those who are new to the faith. Now that may seem to fly in the face of some evidence. Some would argue that large, program-driven, mono-voice churches with charismatic leaders are the ones that are attractive and are growing. And yes, there is some evidence that that is happening, although there is also plenty of evidence that the throughput in many of those churches is enormous. People come, but don't stay. I'm not convinced that that is the way of the future. My suspicion is that many of those churches are a residue of the past rather than harbingers of the future. My suspicion is, as we move into a changing culture, that smaller churches, more relational churches, and certainly more multi-voice churches are far more likely to be sources of community, of faith sharing, and of growth in discipleship. I believe they are potentially far more attractive. Does that word attractive worry some of you? There's been quite a bit of debate in mission circles over the last few years about the difference between incarnational and attractional forms of mission. The argument is that for many centuries the church has operated in attractional mode. The Church of Christendom was at the centre of a supposedly Christian society and simply sat there at the centre expecting and inviting people to come. And so the model of mission was very much a come-to-us model. The argument that many have put forward is that we need to renounce that approach to mission, and instead we need to think about incarnational forms of mission. The church no longer sitting at the centre of a supposedly Christian society, but the church as a mission community looking to penetrate society in a whole range of ways, incarnating the good news in many different aspects of society. Incarnational mission, we're told, is the way forward. Now, I have a great deal of sympathy with that. I believe that that is a shift that we need to make, a shift from a come-to-us approach to mission to a go-to-them form of mission. That's very much, I think, the thrust of the Great Commission at the end of Matthew's Gospel. It's about going and making disciples, not simply issuing invitations to come into church buildings and church programs. However, I don't want to polarize those two approaches too far. It seems to me that biblical mission has both a come and a go dimension to it. There is certainly the command to go and make disciples, but there is also, I believe, the invitation to come and be part of the Christian community. And while attractional may not be a very helpful adjective, I do think we should be looking for churches that are attractive, churches that live out the good news that we're seeking to incarnate and explain. And it does seem to me that if we're going to give attention to being attractive churches, then a multi-voiced approach to church is part of the picture, to invite people to become part of a community where they're not simply customers or clients or passive, but are active participants in a community that is learning and growing together. Yes, I know that some people would much prefer to be anonymous in a large congregation, at least for a while, and maybe those sorts of churches do have their place. But if we're going to be making disciples, rather than simply attracting people into our meetings, then I think we need to give much more attention to developing multi-voiced communities, where people are known and loved and welcomed and encouraged to participate and encouraged to discover the gifts that God has given to them. Okay, I think that's probably enough. We're getting towards the end of the presentation period. Once again, I recognize the irony that I have spent nearly 40 minutes in monologue talking about multi-voiced church. but now is your opportunity to participate and to engage in some multi-voice conversations. It looks like Stan is ready to guide us in that.
Hey, Stuart, thank you very much for your presentation. And again, we've had some good interaction going on in the chat box, and I'm going to try to pull in a couple of those questions. Here's one. If I was able to copy, let's see if paste, by Jeremy, and let's see, get it here, post it so everyone can see it again. Jeremy Ashworth had a statement and a question, and he says, I have a short question that grows from a long observation, being that I agree that there are plenty of churches where things are over-controlled and spirit squelch. My experience has been that few of these over-controlled churches have been brethren congregations. My experience that with brethren congregations that we go too far the other way. And so as you can read the rest of the statement, the question is how do we do healthy quality control in a multi-voice church?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to hear that brethren churches are significantly more multi-voiced than many of the other communities that I'm familiar with. I haven't interacted a great deal with brethren churches, so I look forward to doing that in the future and to enjoying the experience of multi-voiced church in those situations. Yeah, I do think it's a balance, and I also recognize that I have been polarizing the terms mono-voiced and multi-voiced in ways that are almost a caricature at times. I recognize that. I guess it's simply making an argument and wanting to suggest that the dominance of the monologue tradition has been such that we need to work quite hard to reintegrate multi-voice perspectives. At least that's true in many traditions, if not in the brethren. Last week I talked quite a bit about some of the processes and practices needed to ensure that multi-voice learning is helpful and conducive rather than simply distracting. And I think that many of the things that I mentioned then are applicable to other aspects of multi-voice church as well. Leadership is a key issue in multi-voice churches, and one of the difficulties that many leaders have is that they're not trained for it. They're trained to preach, they're trained to lead worship in a particular way, they're trained effectively for mono-voiced culture churches. And so I think there is a retraining that's needed both of congregational leaders and of congregations as a whole. And this will take time, it's not going to happen straight away. And the experience of many churches that have moved from a mono-voiced to a more multi-voiced approach is that there's a battle, and there are lots of things to learn, and the initial results can be somewhat disappointing, and there's a need to press on beyond those initial discouragements into a healthier place. But there is something, I think, about creating an ethos of acceptance, of experimentation. There's something about developing guidelines, putting in place certain processes and practices that enable people to participate well. So, for example, in the whole area of discernment and decision making, there are a range of practices which can be used to enable groups to talk well and listen well together. They're not particularly complicated, they just need to be introduced, and they need to be understood, and there needs to be a willingness to work within those parameters. On the whole issue of the rule of Christ, how we take responsibility to and for each other, I think it's crucial that churches look together at that passage, that foundational passage in Matthew 18, and perhaps at some of the other New Testament material, and ask, how are we going to do this? How in practice are we going to work with this? A church that I knew a few years ago had that passage from Matthew 18 written up on a great poster on their church wall. They saw it every time they came to worship together. And it was there because they had worked on this as a community and had decided, if we fall out with each other, if our brothers and sisters sin against us, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to respond. It was known, it was talked about, it was discussed, and the church had agreed on certain ways in which they would operate. So I think there's quite a bit of preparation work to do. We're not going to get it right straight away. It's going to be, to some extent, trial and error, but I do think there's something about creating the right ethos, and there's something about very practical processes that can enable us to build communities that are flourishing in these areas rather than struggling.
You early in your comments, as you responded to this question, you made reference to leadership and the training and the skills of leaders today. Kathleen Brinkmeyer raises the question: what is the role of the pastor or ordained leadership in a multi-voice setting? I would also add to that, what are the skills of leadership that a pastor needs in multi-voice setting compared to what is needed in a mono-voice setting?
I think one of the key roles of a leader in a multi-voice setting is that of coach. Someone who can work with members of the congregation to enable them to discover the gifts that they have, to learn how to use those gifts effectively, which will quite often mean encouragement and will sometimes mean correction and advice on how to participate more creatively and more helpfully. So I think the coaching role is a very significant one. I think creating this ethos that I mentioned earlier is tremendously important. This requires church leaders to be community builders. It requires them to have skills which will build confidence and encouragement and freedom within the community. To be in a community where you are frightened that if you say anything at all and get it wrong, someone's going to jump on you, is not conducive to multi-voice church life. And so there's something about creating an ethos of acceptance, of welcome, of permission giving, which I think is tremendously important. I think it's a move away, really, from performance to encouraging participation. It's the role of the church leader more as curator than as superstar. In many emerging churches, there is a preference for this term curator, particularly in terms of worship. One of the discoveries of many emerging churches that have been planted in the last 10 years or so, in an attempt to engage more effectively with a changing culture, is a move towards participation rather than performance. There is a very distinctive multi-voice dimension to many of these emerging churches, and worship curator is one of the phrases that is used by many practitioners and commentators. And it's the image of an art exhibition and the role of the curator, who is not there to display the brilliance of his own or her own artwork, but to provide a context within which many different artists, many different performers can display what they have been gifted to do. And I think that's quite a helpful image, quite a helpful analogy. Or to go back to the image of the orchestra that I used early on in the presentation. Many, many different instruments. And the role of the conductor is to bring in the different instruments at times that are appropriate and to make sure that there is harmony rather than cacophony. So maybe conductor and curator are two words that might be helpful as we reimagine what leadership looks like in a multi-voiced community.
Stuart, there's another question that with the statement that says, a successful multi-voice entity would require a great deal of caring about the entire community by all participants. What about those that are quite content to be spectators and not players? Or participants?
My impression is that the larger the congregation, the more spectators you are likely to have, and the more spectators can get by without being expected to participate. For a variety of reasons, it seems to me that multi-voice church is much more likely to flourish in smaller relational communities rather than very large communities. One of my concerns about large churches is the degree of spectatorism that they allow or encourage. I do have a certain ambivalence about this. I recognize that for some people, particularly those who are new to faith or those who are reluctant to participate for a variety of personal reasons, to be in an environment where multiple participation is expected can be quite challenging, quite threatening. some people do enjoy the anonymity of larger communities where they're not expected to participate. One of the rather strange trends that we have here in the UK at the moment is growth in cathedral congregations. Anglican cathedrals up and down the country are reporting growth in numbers. At a time when the British Church is shrinking in numbers generally, these ancient, traditional Christendom models of church appear to be thriving. My suspicion is there are a number of reasons for that, but certainly one of the reasons that comes out of the research is that some people enjoy being able to go to what are effectively brilliant performances in aesthetically pleasing surroundings where they're not expected to participate. They can sit in the back row, they can spectate, if you call it that, and then leave again without anybody requiring them to do anything or say anything. So I recognise there is a place for that, but I see that very much as a starting point. I don't think that's a place where mature discipleship develops. It seems to me that that is more like a shop window than the form of church that is going to produce mature disciples. So I do not want to be part of a church that encourages spectators. I want to be part of a church that allows people to sit quietly if they want to, where there is no pressure on people to participate more than they want, but where there is an ethos of openness, where there is a general expectation that all voices are welcome and all voices are valued, and where we do discover ways of encouraging the wary, the frightened, the unconfident to be able to participate as well, believing that the Spirit of God does not speak only through the articulate or through the confident, that each member of the community is a channel through which the Spirit can speak to the whole community.
Yeah. Your comments earlier about pastor, leader as a coach, and also using the images, and also the worship leader as curator and conductor, has created quite a conversation in the chat box here. People are really connecting with that. And then it's bringing in that big fear of change. Talk about, again, we're back to experiencing the change of changing a culture in a church. Mike Fletcher makes the comment, it seems to me the pace of change is vital. Pastors seem to talk a lot about changing in terms of miles, but the congregation is thinking in terms of feet.
Yeah.
Sorry I didn't put that in the metric system.
My experience is simply quite varied. There are no, feet and miles are fine in the UK.
Okay.
Yeah, but my experience is quite varied, really. I can certainly think of churches where the leadership is very clearly wanting to move in a multi-voice direction, and the congregation is dragging its feet some way behind. My wife and I led a church weekend a few months ago for a Baptist minister in Birmingham, in England. And he is really quite passionate about leading the church in a more multi-voice direction. We had a weekend together with the community, and we were able to explore a variety of ways of operating in a more multi-voice way. And we actually found the congregation open and conducive to that, but we knew from what Trevor, the pastor of the church, had said, that he had had some battles, that he had taken 2 or 3 years to introduce the church to some of these crazy new ideas, and it had taken a while. There had been opposition. For a while he'd felt discouraged that the church really wasn't with him in this, and he'd pulled back a bit. But our experience was that with a bit of persistence he was making progress. We've come across other congregations where the congregation is ahead of the pastor, where there is a willingness and a desire to be involved in a multi-voiced form of church, and it's actually the leadership that's holding back because of the fear of change, the fear of loss of control. I think loss of control is a really big thing. And sometimes that's based in a real sense of responsibility before God for the life and the health of the congregation, and a fear that letting go, letting things get out of control, somehow betrays that responsibility before God that pastors feel. There are some congregations that just seem to be naturally multi-voiced. My wife Sian was pastor of a Baptist church in Oxford a few years ago. A small community on the edge of the city, a community of the lost and the lame, really, just down the road from a major psychiatric hospital, and a number of the members of the congregation were either staff or patients from the hospital. And so you never quite knew what was going to happen when we met together. But it was always multi-voiced. It was multi-voiced whether you wanted to be or not. I don't think Sian ever preached a monologue sermon there. She tried to from time to time, but there was always some interruption. There was always somebody who wanted to ask a question in the middle, or who wanted to share something in the middle. And it was just a question of adjusting to the realities of how that community operated, and enjoying it, and recognizing that some of the interjections were so far off the wall it was difficult to know how to bring things back into centre ground again. But others were gifts of the Spirit. Others were tremendous insights that enhanced the learning of the community. So I do think it varies. I think there are situations where the pastor is way ahead of the congregation, others where it's the pastor who's holding the congregation back. In our own church 2 or 3 years ago, we had a situation where the worship band was absent on one Sunday. Now, this is a church that until about 6-7 years ago had no worship band. In fact, it had practically no musicians at all. It was a church almost devoid of gifted musicians. And then a number of musicians joined the church, and a worship band developed with guitars and keyboard and drums. And the church enjoyed this. The Jamaican members of the church love a good beat, and worship changed its style in significant ways. But in some ways, I think it hindered the development of multi-voice worship in the church. And one Sunday 3 or 4 years ago, when the band was away, all the members of the band just happened to be away that Sunday, I had responsibility for leading this particular service, and using 1 Corinthians 14 as a basis, introduced an opportunity for multi-voice worship. And there was just an eruption. People all over the place were participating in ways they hadn't been when the band was dictating how we worship together. So sometimes I think it's the pastor or the worship leader who is holding back the development of multi-voiced worship, or multi-voiced discernment, or multi-voiced learning. Sometimes it's the other way around. I don't think you can force a community into it. I think you can teach, instruct, inspire, encourage, but this needs to be something which is widely owned within the community if it's not to cause damage.
Stan, I'm afraid your mic is still muted. Why don't you bring your mic back with us?
I muted because of a phone call. One of the statements that you made had to do with the Matthew 18 text, as for in a sense of changing a culture where it's viewed as it's leadership heavy in terms of accountability and discipline when thinking in terms of the rule of Christ. What are some of the best ways to start making that shift in the culture and the thinking of a congregation as well?
I think that this is a subject that I've taught on over a number of years, sometimes in local churches, but sometimes also in training courses. In fact, I'm teaching on the subject this coming weekend in a training course, and we will look together at Matthew 18, at this passage. We will take a bit of time to explore some of the implications of it. We will use a case study to look at what this might look like in practice, and we will work together in small groups around that case study. But one of the things that I always say to people in that particular session is, whatever you think of this teaching, please don't go and try and do it in your church next Sunday morning. You will cause chaos. There is a process that you need to work through. You can't suddenly start doing it. An analogy that I sometimes use is, well, a few years ago I was on a train. I was travelling from Oxford, where I lived at that time, to Manchester in the northwest of England. And it was one of those journeys where everything possible went wrong. The train was delayed, there was a problem on the track, then we got behind a very slow-moving goods train, and we were already an hour and a half late, and we were still a long way from Manchester. And we got to a town called Crewe, which is about an hour south of Manchester, and there was an announcement on the train that said, this train is no longer going to Manchester. We're going to head straight for Glasgow in Scotland. Mm. Now, they did give us the option of getting off at Crewe and catching a very slow train to Manchester, which I took, but I have to say I felt somewhat unimpressed. When I got on the train, it said it was going to Manchester, and to be told halfway along the journey, no, we're going to Glasgow instead, didn't seem fair. And I think it's a bit like that with churches in Matthew 18, that if you're part of a community that hasn't signed up to the process that is described in Matthew 18, and then suddenly somebody suggests this is what we ought to be doing, it can feel a bit unfair. We didn't sign up for this. And so I think it's important for churches to spend quite a bit of time working on this passage, and on many other passages in the New Testament on a similar theme. One of the things that I notice on this subject is that every strand of New Testament teaching has a reference to this kind of process. In Paul's writing, in Peter's writing, in Acts, everywhere there is an expectation that this is part of what it means to be the community of the kingdom. I noticed that Matthew 18 is one of only 2 places in the Gospels where the word church appears on the lips of Jesus. So we don't know what Jesus thought about church membership or church buildings or organs or guitars or many of the other paraphernalia of church life. We do know that he wanted us as recovering sinners to deal well with each other in community. So I think it's worth spending a bit of time really exploring that area of teaching together, and together deciding what are we going to do about it? How are we going to develop this process among us? I think one of the difficulties that some churches face is that they don't really grapple with this issue until there's a bit of a crisis. Yeah. So the treasurer has run off with the money, or the minister has run off with his secretary, or something disastrous for the life of the community happens, and suddenly somebody says, Matthew 18, that's what we need to do. And it's applied in a kind of emergency way without proper preparation, and it often causes more trouble than the problem itself. I just think that's a ridiculous way of going about it. It's a little bit like waiting until the outbreak of war for a congregation to decide whether it thinks that Christians should participate in war or not. It's the wrong time to do it. Decide in peacetime, and then when war breaks out, you have some principles and some decisions to work with. So I think it's a long process, and it also, I think, requires the church to look very carefully at itself. Is this the kind of community that has the maturity to practice this kind of process? And so it's a bit of a chicken and egg. What kind of community can practice this, and what kind of community is produced when this sort of practice happens? But it certainly requires a process and a level of ownership, I think, and it's far better done before the crisis strikes.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point about whether a congregation is really able to practice it as well. Gimbia makes a statement and a good question. Here she says, I have participated in a few congregations where there is a vibrant Bible study practice in a way that I think reflects the participatory biblical literacy idea of the multi-voice church described by Stuart. However, that careful conversation and study does not seem to survive the cross into the 10 o'clock call to worship. Why is that, and are there ways we can take what's working to expand the conversations?
One of the responses that I sometimes get to what I've been saying about multi-voice learning is, well, why change the monologue sermon? Let's continue with the monologue sermon at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and then we will do our multi-voice learning together in Bible study groups, either in adult Sunday school or in midweek groups. And that's a good balance, that you have the monologue when you're all together for Sunday worship, and then many opportunities for multi-voice learning during the rest of the week. Sometimes I think that can work very well, but I think the issue that the participant has identified is an important one. Unless we develop multi-voiced practices within our main worship gatherings, it feels disconnected. It feels as if the monologue sermon or the carefully crafted front-led worship, that's the professional church operating. Everything else is rather secondary. So it does seem to me that we need to introduce multi-voice practices into our main gatherings, as well as into these often more peripheral gatherings. Otherwise, the life of the community seems to be fragmented.
There's a question as well regarding the multi-voice congregation. Given the changes that you're seeing in terms of Europe and the UK for ordained ministry, what do you foresee for countries like the United States, where ordained ministry has become such a profession and a vocation for many people? And what does the future hold for ordained ministers and ordination, in general, when we think about that topic? And you're talking to quite a few ministers on this.
It's a huge question. I'm fairly reluctant to make any kind of predictions about the future of Christianity in North America. I'm aware that there are divergent views as to whether the future of the church in the US in particular is likely to be more or less the same as the future of the church in Europe, only maybe a generation behind, or whether there is a very different future, whether there are different dynamics within US society which will lead to a different kind of future for the church. I'm simply agnostic on that. My suspicion, for what it's worth, which isn't much, is that probably North America is going to follow Europe in a lot of ways, although I suspect there will be some quite significant variants as well. And so I don't really know quite what that means for the future of ordained ministry and ordination in the US context. I think in the UK context, much of it is simply financially driven, that we simply don't have the finances in many of our churches to afford full-time ministers any longer. There is sometimes funding for part-time ministers, but a combination of salary and housing and pension provision has meant that full-time ordained ministry is beyond the reach of increasing numbers of congregations. And training institutions are beginning to recognize that. There is increasingly a recognition of the need to train bivocational ministers, self-supporting ministers, rather than assuming that there will always be paid jobs available for those who have graduated from seminaries. But I think the other thing that I notice is that in many emerging churches, it's not money that is driving the change, it's a preference. It's a conviction that it is far better for those who have responsibility within the church to be rooted in the life of the community beyond the church, rather than professional ministers. And so even those emerging churches that have the finances, the resources to release people into full-time ministry choose not to. They sometimes choose to release one or two people into part-time ministry, sometimes nobody at all. They choose instead to operate as a community of volunteers, with the conviction that it is far better for everybody to be rooted in the wider community rather than to be spending all their time in church circles. So I think there are ideological as well as financial issues here. I don't know whether those are going to impact the US scene in the same way. I'm simply not familiar enough with it to know to what extent that's already happening. And there are some ideological challenges also to the whole notion of ordination. Even if you still have people who are working for the church, paid by the church, what does ordination mean? And to what extent is this something which is a hangover from Christendom rather than something which is authentically biblical? My wife and I disagree on this. My wife is an ordained Baptist minister, and she went through the process of training and calling by a church and ordination, and for her it matters and is significant. I am untrained and unordained and determined to remain so. I have been a church planter and I've been in pastoral leadership, but not as an ordained minister. Whether it's my Plymouth Brethren roots, or whether it's my Anabaptist convictions, or simply the way I read the Bible, I'm not sure. But this is not something which I am inclined towards. My view of ordination is very simple. I call it baptism.
Yeah. Huh. Sounds strangely Anabaptist.
Believers is sufficient ordination.
Yeah.
And therefore, a multi-voice church.
Yeah. I want to make sure we get a couple of these questions in here.
The community of the baptized to participate together.
Sorry, Stuart, I interrupted. Jeremy has a question, and he said, did the UK beat the United States on the megachurch movement, i.e. did those or start popping up in the UK first?
I wouldn't have thought so. I suppose the original megachurches were the communities that emerged in the 4th and 5th century in Europe, when the church became part of empire, and you suddenly got congregations of thousands in these great basilicas. But megachurch has not really been the experience in Britain over quite a long time now. We have watched with interest the development of megachurches in the US, and have generally commented that we don't have anything of that kind here. The number of church congregations in the UK with over 1,000 members is relatively small. The only megachurch examples I think in the UK at the moment would be African. The largest churches in the UK are now African churches, Nigerian, Ghanaian. There are very, very few churches that are predominantly Anglo that have anything of that kind at all. So no, megachurch hasn't really been our experience, and there is I think a cultural predilection against that. We don't like big.
Okay. I'm going to go back to a statement and a question by Gimbia. She's asking, do you know if there is a recognized through research, theories, or surveys the connection between the younger generation, those of who have come of age with social media and have the high expectation to be part of the broader conversations, and a platform to share their views and their views of the multi-voice church? And if so, is it possible that, if you have some resources that come to mind, we could even share those at a later point?
Sure. I don't think I have in my mind any specific research evidence. I think there's plenty of anecdotal evidence, and there are certainly resources on the emerging churches, which tend to attract people in their 20s and 30s primarily, which are participative, multi-voiced in the way that I've described. A book that I'm currently reading is called The Gospel After Christendom by Ryan Bolger, who is at Fuller Seminary, and it is a survey of emerging churches across the globe, looking at their practices in a variety of ways. I'm about halfway through it, so I can't comment on the whole of it, but again and again the stories that are told and the reflections in that book are of multi-voiced expressions of church, and these are primarily for adults in their 20s and 30s. So no, I don't have that kind of research evidence to hand, but I think there is quite a bit of that kind of storytelling and books that introduce the younger churches and indicate that participation is becoming the norm there.
Yeah. I do have a question out of curiosity. Is the church being pushed, not pushed, but spurred into being more multi-voice because culture has been moving there ahead of the church? When I think of just in terms of information and resources that are out there on organizational dynamics, they've been talking, in a sense, the multi-voice organization since the 1960s. It's been growing since then. Is this something that, unfortunately, the culture has, in a sense, been more, if you want to say, scripturally attuned than what the church has been?
Yes, I'm interested to use the word unfortunately there.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think that there are in contemporary culture that the church is to some extent catching up with developments elsewhere. Is that unfortunate? Well, yes, in a sense, I guess it is, that you would hope that the Christian community would be more attuned to the voice of God. But if we believe in the God of all creation, if we believe in the Missio Dei, then I think we need to be open to God bypassing the Christian community if we're not listening, and impacting culture more directly. I think we've seen that in a variety of ways over the last century or more. It's humbling for us, and therefore the word unfortunate I resonate with. But I think it's even more unfortunate if we dig our heels in and say, well, since we didn't discover it first, we're not going to do it. I think we need to be open to what the Spirit of God is doing in wider culture. One thing I have noticed when I've talked about the Matthew 18 passage, and increasingly I think in the last 2 or 3 years, rather than before that, the number of people who have reflected with me, do you know, that's very similar to the processes that we have at work for resolving conflict. We have a very similar kind of process spelled out. We're used to this, and we hadn't realized that it was something which churches were meant to do as well. We hadn't seen the connection between our work practices and Matthew 18. So again, maybe an example of good practice in business being something that we can learn from if we have the grace and humility to do that.
Well, it seems too that at times some of our members are almost living out of two different value sets. You have one that's in the workplace where they're practicing and living out of a multi-voice church, and then they set the Monday through Friday aside, or whatever the work schedule is, and then they move into Sunday, and they still are somewhat resistant to bringing in a multi-voice, in a sense, culture into the congregation. What are, I guess my question is what are the assumptions that we're making about a multi-voice church that we're not putting our finger on that can help us, make this transition? What might be some of the assumptions, or some of the assumptions that you've come across that church leaders or congregational members are making about the multi-voice church?
One of the reasons for resistance to multi-voice church practices that I've heard a number of times is from people who, as you say, in their Monday to Friday life are participating in a whole range of multi-voice practices, who say, well, when I come to church on a Sunday, I don't want more of the same. I actually just want to sit and listen to a good sermon. I want to be led into worship by gifted worship leaders. What I don't want is to be expected and required to participate in a multi-voiced way. I'm tired. I just need to be fed and nourished and encouraged. Now I think we need to hear that. And if multi-voice church simply comes across as demanding yet more from people who are already more or less at capacity, then I think we are doing a disservice to people. So I think there are questions about capacity. There are questions about whether a multi-voiced church equates to busyness and excessive demand. But I think also there's something about what happens to people when they cross the threshold into church. And it seems to me that people can behave very differently and very strangely in church. People who are highly competent and very happy to participate in other spheres of life become almost infantile in the congregation. Just simply seem to revert to some kind of childishness and unwillingness to play an active participatory role. There is something about church culture that has developed over the years which seems to have allowed or encouraged that. And I do think there are certainly some church leaders who collude with that or even encourage that, who are somewhat frightened by the prospect of gifted, articulate people in the congregation who may participate in ways that they feel cast a poor light upon their own contributions. It seems to me one of the reasons why some congregational leaders aren't willing to move in a multi-voice direction is simply fear that others might be able to do some things better than they can, which is difficult. So I think there's a range of cultural things there. And again, I would suggest it's something that a congregation needs to talk about, needs to surface and explore together, rather than allowing these things just to be under the surface. There's some conversation going on here that I'd like to pick up on. In terms of pastoral leadership, congregational leadership, how do you see the roles of that image of pastor or leader as shepherd and pastor or leader as coach? Could you help to define some of that for people that are connecting here? I think the image of pastor as shepherd is a beautiful image. It's clearly a very deeply rooted biblical image. You find it in Old and New Testament, and in fact I think one of my favourite aspects of that is Peter's description of himself as an under shepherd, Jesus as the chief shepherd, and the pastor Peter as a shepherd of the sheep. It's interesting that in the very early years of the church, when they depicted Jesus in art or in sculpture, he was almost always depicted as a shepherd carrying a lamb on his shoulders. We have many examples of that in the artwork of the early church. And it's interesting that when the church became part of empire and began to take on imperial structures and attitudes, that the picture of Jesus changed quite dramatically. The pastoral shepherd figure became an authority figure. Jesus was usually at least a few feet above the ground, floating in the midair and looking rather like a Roman emperor. But the pastoral image didn't get lost. The pastor figure, the shepherd with the lamb across his shoulders, is transferred to Peter. Peter becomes the shepherd. Jesus is now the Pantocrator, the world ruler. So I think it's a deeply rooted image and one that is very precious. However, like all images, I would suggest it has its limitations. And for me, one of the limitations of it is that it seems to suggest a complete separation between shepherds and sheep. Putting it rather bluntly, there is absolutely nothing a sheep can do to become a shepherd. These are two different categories of being. Sheep do not become shepherds. Sheep become kebabs or roast dinners. They don't become shepherds. And one of my concerns about the overuse of this image is that it plays into clericalism. It plays into an expectation that there are some who have this designated role as shepherds and the rest of us are sheep. And sheep tend to be fairly passive in our experience, I guess. So I think it's a good image. It's one we need to hold on to. The shepherd who leads his sheep, the shepherd who provides and protects and so on. I just think we shouldn't overplay it. And the role of a pastor, of a shepherd in a multi-voiced church seems to me to move beyond the traditional shepherd-sheep dichotomy. That's where I would introduce concepts of coaching, of encouragement, of equipping, of training, and so on. So it's a great image, but I just think we need to be careful we don't do with it more than Scripture does.
I forget now the name of the New Testament scholar that also noted that in the image of shepherd and sheep, that it is an economic image as well, and that the sheep are there for the shepherd was one of the points he used to make too. Stuart, what a wonderful presentation, and we've had some great interaction from people that have been participating and watching webinar today, and want to thank everyone for their comments and observations and questions as well. And Stuart, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you again, and glad that we could partner to do this once more. I'm going to invite Enton into our conversation because he has some instructions for us regarding continuing education and also an online poll. Enton?
Great, thanks, Dan. I do want to remind folks, if you have a few last questions, to go ahead and type those in. But we have two polls for you here. We'd be glad for your feedback on how helpful the presentation was, meeting Stuart's content, as well as the second question, how well did you like this webinar format? Your feedback allows us to continue to sharpen what we do. You can see on your screen as well, for those that wish to obtain continuing education units, there's a link right there. I'll post that live link right into your chat window. There you go. So you can click that link, and we ask that you go ahead and complete that request within, say, the next 24 hours, so that we can then take that link down, because just live attendance here is what we're offering continuing education units for. Stuart, I'm again just delighted to have you with us. Thank you so much. I hope that Stan can twist your arm and bring you back for another series again. Stan, again, I really appreciate your way of being able to interact and make this a multi-voice presentation. So, turning it back to the two of you.
Okay. Just would like to keep everybody informed as well. Our next scheduled webinars are set for April 9 and 16 with Dr. Deborah Dean Murphy, and the focus is going to be on really, let me get it out here. I had it at one point. The subversive act of missional worship is related to it, and how worship plays a key role in discipleship and Christian education. And so Dr. Deborah Murphy has written several books on the subject, and we invite you back for those events as well. Stuart, is there anything that you would like to say or share?
No, I don't think so. I've had plenty of opportunity to present, and I'm grateful for that. This is a subject that I feel passionately about, so I'm grateful to the opportunity of riding my hobby horse over the last couple of weeks, and I'd be very happy to participate in one of these webinars again if it's a subject that I know something about. But thank you, and I look forward once again to reading the chat box at leisure and hearing more of the ongoing discussion. Thank you. I'll sign off and wish you, well, good night from me.
Okay, blessings, Stuart, and we look forward to working with you in the future as well. Thank you again. Thanks for your time.